Operation Mars, launched in late 1942, was a major Soviet offensive aimed at eliminating the German-held Rzhev salient west of Moscow. To understand its context, one must consider the broader geopolitical and military landscape of the Eastern Front during this period. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 under Operation Barbarossa had resulted in devastating losses for the Red Army and the occupation of vast Soviet territories. By 1942, the front had stabilized somewhat, with fierce fighting along a wide front, stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. Despite setbacks, the Soviet Union had begun to recover its strength through rapid industrial mobilization, mass conscription, and improved military organization. The Rzhev salient, a bulge in the front lines extending towards Moscow, remained a strategic thorn in the Soviet side. It posed a direct threat to the Soviet capital and served as a launching point for German operations. For the Germans, maintaining the salient was crucial to safeguarding supply routes and maintaining pressure on Moscow. On the Soviet side, eliminating the salient was a key objective in regaining the initiative. National interests were aligned with a broader Allied strategy to wear down German forces through attrition. But the Soviet leadership also faced immense pressure to deliver tangible victories, to boost morale, and demonstrate progress. Military preparedness on both sides was mixed. The Red Army had undergone extensive reorganization and training, but many units were still inexperienced, and logistical challenges persisted. Intelligence estimates of German strength around Rzhev varied, often underestimating the depth and resilience of German defenses. Soviet public sentiment, tightly controlled by state propaganda, was cautiously optimistic, but tempered by the harsh realities of prolonged warfare and heavy casualties. The operation was planned amid this complex interplay of strategic imperatives, limited intelligence, and immense pressure from Stalin's leadership. Operation Mars began in late November 1942 with the Soviet Kalinin and Western fronts launching coordinated attacks against the German Ninth Army entrenched in the Rzhev salient. Commanded by General Georgy Zhukov on the Soviet side and General Walter Model for the Germans, the operation sought to encircle and destroy the salient. The initial phase featured massive artillery barrages intended to weaken German defenses, followed by infantry and tank assaults aimed at breaching fortified lines. The German defenders, anticipating the offensive, had prepared extensive fortifications including trenches, minefields, and bunkers, making the battlefield highly challenging. The initial movements involved Soviet troops advancing through dense forests and frozen swamps under harsh winter conditions, complicating logistics and mobility. Communication and coordination among Soviet units were crucial but problematic due to terrain and weather. German command structures were highly disciplined and flexible, enabling rapid reinforcement and counterattack. The opening phase was marked by intense fighting, with neither side achieving a decisive breakthrough, setting the stage for a prolonged and brutal campaign. Strategically, Operation Mars aimed to eliminate the German threat posed by the Rzhev salient by encircling and destroying the Ninth Army. Soviet objectives included regaining lost territory and securing the approaches to Moscow. Logistics were complex, requiring extensive stockpiles of ammunition, winter equipment, and fuel to sustain the offensive during the severe Russian winter. Soviet military doctrine emphasized combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. But executing this in the difficult terrain and climate proved challenging. Preparations were thorough but flawed. Soviet planners underestimated the strength of German defenses and overestimated their own forces' ability to maintain offensive momentum under harsh conditions. Propaganda portrayed the operation as a critical step toward victory, bolstering morale and public support, though details were tightly controlled to conceal setbacks. On the German side, maintaining the salient was vital for operational flexibility and morale, leading to substantial fortification efforts and rapid troop rotations to meet Soviet assaults. The first engagements of Operation Mars unfolded with heavy fighting and high casualties. Soviet forces launched massive artillery barrages, followed by infantry assaults, encountering well-prepared German defensive positions. Territorial gains were limited as German troops repelled attacks with effective use of trenches, machine guns, and counterattacks. The terrain favored defenders. Dense forests and frozen swamps restricted movement and exposed Soviet troops to concentrated fire. Civilian populations suffered greatly, caught in the crossfire and enduring bombardments. Harsh winter conditions exacerbated displacement and shortages of food and shelter. Morale among Soviet troops was tested as initial optimism faded amid slow progress and mounting losses. Unexpectedly, strong German resistance and logistical difficulties foreshadowed a protracted and costly battle with no immediate decisive outcomes. As the operation continued into December, the conflict escalated in intensity. Both sides committed reinforcements amid deteriorating weather conditions. Casualties mounted, particularly among Soviet infantry engaged in repeated frontal assaults. Command and control challenges arose due to complex coordination requirements, terrain, and communication breakdowns. Political tensions surfaced within the Soviet leadership as doubts about the operation's feasibility increased. Internationally, Operation Mars attracted little attention, overshadowed by the dramatic Soviet victory at Stalingrad. German commanders skillfully used interior lines to reinforce threatened sectors and launch counterattacks, maintaining defensive integrity despite attrition. The harsh winter, snow, and ice further complicated logistics and troop movements for both armies, deepening the crisis on the battlefield. The campaign's peak featured some of the most intense fighting of the Eastern Front, winter of 1942–43. Soviet forces launched large-scale assaults aiming to break German lines and encircle the salient. German defenders, including elite units, mounted stiff resistance and counteroffensives. Command decisions weighed heavily, balancing aggressive action against the need to preserve forces. Civilian suffering intensified with widespread destruction of villages and towns due to artillery and aerial bombardments. Displacement increased amid scarce shelter and resources. Despite localized Soviet gains, the overall front remained largely static, illustrating the brutal attritional nature of the campaign, where enormous losses yielded little strategic progress. Facing mounting losses and stalemate, Soviet forces adapted their tactics. Defensive consolidation and selective counterattacks replaced costly frontal assaults. Partisan activity behind German lines increased, targeting supply and communication routes. Soviet command sought better resource allocation and improvements in combined arms coordination, though terrain and weather imposed severe constraints. Morale fluctuated. Political officers intensified efforts to maintain fighting spirit amid fatigue and hardship. The prolonged and grinding nature of the battle exacted a heavy psychological toll on soldiers, testing endurance and discipline. Despite adversity, many troops remained committed under ideological motivation and military discipline. No decisive turning point emerged. Operation Mars ended in a costly stalemate, failing to achieve encirclement or destruction of German forces. The German Ninth Army held firm, inflicting heavy casualties on the Soviets while remaining tied down in exhausting defense. Soviet losses weakened their operational capabilities, delaying efforts to secure the region. Civilian populations continued to endure suffering from prolonged combat, displacement, and destruction. The stalemate highlighted the difficulties of conducting offensives against entrenched defenses under adverse conditions. The failure prompted reassessment within the Soviet High Command, influencing future operational planning and command assignments. Combat operations ceased as exhaustion and depletion set in. Soviet forces withdrew to more defensible lines, and German troops maintained the salient until strategic shifts in mid-1943 forced withdrawal. The region lay devastated, infrastructure destroyed, populations displaced, and humanitarian crises unfolding amid the harsh winter. Reprisals and security operations by both sides compounded civilian suffering. Operation Mars remains a relatively obscure episode, overshadowed by more prominent battles such as Stalingrad and Kursk. Its legacy is one of heavy attrition and limited strategic success, underscoring the immense human and material costs of the Eastern Front's brutal warfare. Lessons learned informed Soviet improvements in military doctrine, logistics, and coordination. Politically, the failure was downplayed in Soviet propaganda to maintain morale and the narrative of unstoppable advance. Culturally, the battle is mainly remembered in Russian and Eastern European military history, with limited commemoration or public awareness elsewhere. It serves as a testament to the sacrifices endured and the complexities faced in the protracted struggle against German forces. Operation Mars exemplifies the brutal attritional nature of the Eastern Front, reflecting the immense challenges of offensive warfare against deeply entrenched defenders amid harsh environmental conditions. It stands as a sobering reminder of the human cost of war and the strategic difficulties faced by both belligerents in one of history's largest and bloodiest conflicts. In late November 1942, Operation Mars commenced amid the unforgiving cold and bleak terrain of the Rzhev salient, approximately 140 miles west of Moscow. This offensive represented a concerted effort by the Soviet Kalinin and Western fronts to encircle and destroy the German Ninth Army, which held a precarious but strategically vital position, threatening the Soviet capital. The operation's launch coincided with the Soviet Union's simultaneous monumental offensive at Stalingrad, known as Operation Uranus. While Stalingrad attracted much of the world's attention, Operation Mars unfolded in relative secrecy, reflecting Stalin's dual-front strategy to overwhelm German forces on multiple axes. The Soviet offensive was placed under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, one of the Red Army's most prominent and ambitious commanders. Zhukov, famed for his role in defending Moscow and orchestrating counteroffensives throughout the war, was tasked with directing this complex operation involving several armies. His leadership reflected both Stalin's confidence in his tactical acumen and the desperate need to regain ground and initiative on the Eastern Front. Zhukov's reputation was such that his presence on any front signaled a major strategic push, and Operation Mars was no exception. Opposing the Soviet forces was the German Ninth Army, commanded by General Walter Model, a seasoned and respected officer known for his defensive expertise and tenacity. Model's leadership was instrumental in maintaining German control over the salient despite increasing pressure from Soviet attacks. The salient itself was a formidable bulge into Soviet lines, fortified with extensive defensive works developed since 1941. Trenches, bunkers, minefields, and barbed wire networks were carefully laid out in depth, creating a layered and difficult terrain for any attacker. The initial phase of the operation began with massive artillery bombardments, aimed at weakening German frontline positions. Soviet forces amassed a large concentration of artillery pieces and mortars, intending to deliver overwhelming firepower in a short period to disrupt German defenses. These barrages, combined with coordinated airstrikes, aimed to soften enemy lines before the infantry and armored units advanced. The sheer scale of the artillery preparation was meant to break through the extensive German fortifications and create openings for mechanized spearheads. Following the bombardments, waves of infantry advanced across snow-covered forests and frozen swamps under bitter winter conditions. The terrain proved challenging for the attackers. Dense woods restricted visibility and movement, while marshy ground limited the maneuverability of tanks and vehicles. Supply lines struggled to keep pace with the frontline troops, complicated by the onset of winter and poor road conditions. Communication between units was often difficult, with radios frequently disrupted and coordination hampered by the fragmented landscape. Despite these obstacles, the Soviet troops pushed forward with determination. Initial attacks targeted multiple sectors to divide German attention and prevent the efficient concentration of reserves. The plan involved simultaneous thrusts from the north and south of the salient, aiming to encircle German forces and sever their supply and communication lines. The offensive depended heavily on timing and synchronization to achieve the envelopment before German units could regroup. German defenders, however, had anticipated the offensive and were well prepared. General Model's command utilized interior lines effectively, rapidly redeploying reserves to threatened sectors. German infantry, supported by artillery and tanks, fought fiercely to repel Soviet advances. Counterattacks were launched quickly, often restoring lost ground and disrupting Soviet momentum. The German troops benefited from extensive experience in defensive warfare, utilizing the terrain to their advantage and operating within well-coordinated command structures. The opening phase also revealed key challenges in Soviet command and control. While Zhukov's leadership provided overall direction, coordination among multiple armies and corps was hampered by communication difficulties and the complexity of the operational plan. Some Soviet attacks were isolated or delayed, allowing German defenders to concentrate fire and launch countermeasures effectively. In some sectors, units became bogged down in intense fighting without achieving their objectives, leading to significant casualties. On the political front, Stalin and the Soviet High Command closely monitored the offensive. Stalin's insistence on simultaneous operations, Operation Uranus at Stalingrad and Operation Mars at Rzhev, reflected a broader strategy to overstretch German defenses and deliver decisive blows on multiple fronts. However, the secrecy surrounding Operation Mars limited public awareness and international attention. Propaganda focused largely on successes elsewhere, with details of the operation withheld to maintain morale and avoid revealing vulnerabilities. The harsh winter added another dimension to the opening phase. Temperatures often plunged well below freezing, snow hindered movement, and frostbite became a significant hazard. Both Soviet and German soldiers endured these extreme conditions, which strained supply lines and medical support. Equipment malfunctioned, vehicles became immobilized, and the physical toll on troops mounted rapidly. In summary, the opening phase of Operation Mars was characterized by a massive and coordinated Soviet offensive aimed at encircling a critical German position. Despite significant artillery preparation and ambitious objectives, the Soviet troops faced well-prepared defenses, challenging terrain, communication difficulties, and harsh weather. The stage was set for a brutal and protracted struggle, with neither side able to claim a decisive advantage in the initial engagements. The clash between Zhukov's ambitious plans and Model's resolute defense would define the bitter contest that followed in the months ahead. The strategic goals and meticulous planning behind Operation Mars reflected the Soviet leadership's urgent desire to neutralize the German Rzhev salient, a persistent threat looming just west of Moscow. Since the summer of 1941, the salient had enabled German forces to launch disruptive raids and posed a significant danger to Soviet communications and supply lines leading to the capital. For the Soviet High Command, eliminating this bulge was essential not only to secure Moscow's approaches, but also to regain the offensive initiative on the Eastern Front. Operation Mars was conceived as a major coordinated offensive intended to encircle and annihilate the German Ninth Army, thereby crippling German defensive capacity in the region. The operation's strategic objectives were ambitious: Soviet planners envisioned a double envelopment of the salient, with simultaneous offensives launched from the north and south, aiming to trap and destroy the bulk of the German forces holding the area. The encirclement was expected to force a German withdrawal or total surrender, thereby opening the way for further Soviet advances toward Smolensk and beyond. These goals were framed within the larger Soviet effort to push back the Wehrmacht across the entire front and to relieve pressure on other critical sectors, including the Caucasus and Stalingrad. Logistically, Operation Mars required extensive preparation to sustain large-scale offensive operations during the brutal Russian winter. The Soviet command stockpiled vast quantities of artillery ammunition, winter clothing, fuel, and rations. Ensuring adequate supply lines across difficult terrain characterized by dense forests, marshes, and frozen rivers was a daunting challenge. Roads were often impassable due to mud and snow, and railway lines had to be extended and repaired rapidly to meet the demands of troop movements and resupply. Mechanized units faced obstacles as frozen swamps and poor infrastructure impeded tank and vehicle mobility, limiting operational flexibility. The Soviet military doctrine guiding Operation Mars emphasized combined arms tactics, integrating infantry assaults with coordinated armor support and concentrated artillery barrages. The aim was to achieve breakthroughs in German lines and exploit these openings with mechanized forces to encircle and destroy enemy units. However, despite these doctrinal advances, Soviet forces still faced significant difficulties in coordinating large-scale attacks over complex terrain, especially under winter conditions that limited visibility and slowed movement. Preparations were comprehensive but flawed. Soviet intelligence underestimated the depth and resilience of German defensive preparations. The Germans had constructed multiple defensive belts, including trenches, bunkers, minefields, and barbed wire obstacles, carefully camouflaged and layered to absorb and repel assaults. German forces were experienced and battle-hardened, capable of rapid counterattacks and flexible defense, which Soviet planners failed to fully anticipate. Propaganda played an important role in the lead-up to Operation Mars. Soviet media emphasized the offensive as a decisive push toward liberating occupied territory and crushing Nazi forces threatening the Soviet heartland. Official statements praised the heroism of Soviet soldiers and framed the operation as a testament to the unstoppable might of the Red Army. Yet, information about the operation was tightly controlled to maintain secrecy and prevent intelligence leaks. The Soviet public, conditioned by years of hardship and sacrifice, received the operation as a hopeful sign of progress, though full details remained obscure. On the German side, maintaining the Rzhev salient was of paramount strategic importance. It preserved critical supply routes, safeguarded the approaches to Moscow, and served as a base for potential future offensives. German commanders, including General Walter Model, reinforced defensive positions and continuously rotated troops to meet the threat. The Wehrmacht's logistical networks were strained but remained functional, and preparations included the rapid construction of fortifications and the establishment of reserve formations to respond to Soviet breakthroughs. In sum, Operation Mars was the result of careful but optimistic Soviet planning, combining ambitious strategic objectives with extensive logistical efforts and evolving military doctrine. However, critical miscalculations regarding enemy strength, terrain challenges, and coordination complexity foreshadowed the difficulties that would soon engulf the offensive. As Soviet troops prepared to launch their attacks amid bitter winter conditions, the stage was set for a brutal and costly confrontation with a determined and well-prepared German defense. The opening clashes of Operation Mars began with intense and ferocious fighting as Soviet forces launched their offensives in late November 1942. After days of massive artillery bombardments designed to weaken German defensive positions, waves of Soviet infantry and armor advanced into the dense forests and frozen swamps surrounding the Rajov salient. The landscape proved treacherous. Thick woods limited visibility and movement, while marshy ground and ice impeded tank maneuvers and vehicle supply lines, exposing advancing troops to well-prepared German defensive fire. German forces, entrenched in a complex network of fortifications, including trenches, bunkers, minefields, and barbed wire obstacles, offered stiff resistance. Infantry units coordinated with artillery and armor support to repel Soviet assaults, frequently launching rapid counterattacks to regain lost ground. Despite being outnumbered, the defenders capitalized on their familiarity with the terrain and tactical flexibility, often stabilizing sectors where Soviet forces had made initial gains. The first engagements yielded limited territorial shifts. Soviet troops managed to capture some forward German positions, but deeper breakthroughs proved elusive. The Germans' ability to rapidly deploy reserves and their effective command and control helped blunt Soviet momentum. Each Soviet advance was met with fierce opposition, resulting in heavy casualties and slow progress. Command and communication difficulties within the Soviet ranks further hampered coordinated attacks, leading to piecemeal offensives that the Germans exploited. Civilian populations in the Rzev region suffered greatly during these initial battles. Villages and towns were subjected to relentless artillery barrages and aerial bombing campaigns. The winter conditions exacerbated civilian hardship. Many were forced to flee their homes, facing starvation, exposure, and inadequate shelter. Displacement and destruction deepened the humanitarian crisis, underscoring the war's devastating impact beyond the military front lines. Morale among Soviet troops fluctuated as initial hopes for a swift victory dimmed in the face of stubborn resistance and mounting losses. The brutal conditions, combining fierce combat, freezing temperatures, and logistical difficulties, tested the endurance and resolve of soldiers. While political officers and propaganda emphasized the righteousness of their cause and the inevitability of victory, the grim realities on the ground created tension and fatigue. Unexpectedly, strong German defenses and the challenging environment foreshadowed the protracted and costly nature of the campaign. The initial clashes of Operation Mars set the tone for months of grinding attrition warfare, where every meter gained came at tremendous human cost. The early battles underscored the difficulties inherent in overcoming deeply entrenched, well-prepared defenses amid the unforgiving Russian winter, setting the stage for a brutal stalemate that would characterize much of the fighting ahead. As Operation Mars progressed into December 1942, the intensity and scale of combat escalated sharply, transforming the battlefield into a grueling contest of attrition. Both Soviet and German forces committed reinforcements in an effort to either maintain offensive momentum or bolster defenses. The German command skillfully utilized interior lines to rapidly shift troops and artillery to sectors under the greatest threat, enabling effective localized counterattacks that blunted Soviet advances. Casualty rates surged, particularly among Soviet infantry formations repeatedly engaged in frontal assaults against heavily fortified German positions. The severe winter conditions, with temperatures plunging well below freezing, heavy snowfall, and icy terrain, exacerbated operational challenges. Supply lines became precarious, with roads rendered impassable by mud and ice, complicating the delivery of ammunition, fuel, and medical aid. Communications deteriorated as harsh weather and battlefield chaos disrupted radio transmissions, hindering coordinated command and control. These challenges placed significant strain on Soviet command structures. Coordinating complex multi-army operations over difficult terrain proved arduous, and some Soviet attacks were delayed or executed without adequate support. Fragmented assaults allowed German defenders to concentrate firepower and mount effective countermeasures, Morale among Soviet troops suffered amid the mounting losses and limited progress. Political officers intensified ideological education and propaganda efforts to sustain fighting spirit. Yet the prolonged exposure to combat, cold, and exhaustion weighed heavily on soldiers. Within the Soviet High Command, concerns grew regarding the operation's viability and cost. Debates emerged about the allocation of resources, timing of offensives, and the necessity of pressing forward despite mounting difficulties. Meanwhile, international attention remained focused largely on the dramatic Soviet encirclement and defeat of German forces at Stalingrad, overshadowing the bitter and costly fighting around Rzhev. The German Ninth Army, though heavily engaged and sustaining its own losses, demonstrated remarkable resilience. Utilizing entrenched positions and superior tactical coordination, German forces managed to contain Soviet offensives and prevent any decisive breakthroughs. Despite the pressure, German defensive operations maintained cohesion, ensuring the salient's continued existence as a strategic foothold west of Moscow. In this phase, Operation Mars evolved into a prolonged and costly battle of endurance, with neither side able to secure significant advantage. The combination of logistical difficulties, command challenges, weather conditions, and fierce opposition turned the offensive into a war of attrition, exacting a heavy toll on manpower and materiel across both armies. The peak of Operation Mars, unfolding in December 1942 and extending into early 1943, represented one of the most intense and sustained phases of combat on the Eastern Front during the brutal winter months. Soviet forces launched massive coordinated assaults aimed at breaking through the heavily fortified German defensive positions around the Rzhev salient, seeking to fulfill the operation's strategic objective: encirclement and destruction of the German Ninth Army. This period was marked by relentless fighting, heavy casualties, and a stalemate that tested the endurance and resolve of both belligerents. The Soviet offensives during this peak phase involved the concentrated application of artillery, infantry, and armored units in a multi-sectoral assault. Massive artillery barrages preceded infantry advances designed to suppress and destroy German fortifications and create breaches in their defensive belts. Soviet planners aimed to exploit any penetration rapidly with mechanized and tank forces, intending to encircle German formations and sever their supply and retreat routes. These operations were planned with intricate coordination, involving multiple armies under the overall command of General Georgy Zhukov and his subordinates, who sought to synchronize attacks across a broad front despite the challenges posed by terrain and weather. However, the German defenders were resolute and strategically adept. Commanded by General Walter Model, the Ninth Army had prepared an extensive network of defenses over the preceding year, consisting of multiple lines of trenches, bunkers, minefields, barbed wire obstacles, and concealed firing positions. These defensive works were carefully integrated with natural terrain features such as dense forests, marshlands, and riverbanks, creating formidable obstacles to any attacking force. German infantry units, supported by artillery and armored elements, fought tenaciously to hold their ground, utilizing both static defenses and mobile reserves to respond swiftly to Soviet advances. During the peak fighting, German commanders effectively deployed their interior lines, shifting units between threatened sectors with remarkable speed and efficiency despite the difficult winter conditions. This flexible defensive approach allowed German forces to plug breaches, mount counterattacks, and maintain the integrity of the salient. In several sectors, German counteroffensives not only halted Soviet progress, but recaptured lost positions, inflicting further casualties and disrupting Soviet operational plans. The terrain and weather conditions played a significant role in shaping the nature of combat during this phase. The winter of 1942-1943 was among the harshest in recent memory, with temperatures frequently dropping below -30 degrees Celsius, -22 Fahrenheit. Snow and ice covered the battlefield, complicating troop movements, supply efforts, and the operation of vehicles and artillery. The frozen marshes and rivers presented both obstacles and opportunities. While mobility was severely restricted, the solidified ground sometimes allowed movement across areas that would otherwise have been impassable in warmer months. Soviet logistical and communication challenges were exacerbated by these conditions. Supplying frontline troops with ammunition, fuel, food, and medical aid became an arduous task. Roads were often rendered unusable by snowdrifts and ice, and rail lines suffered damage from ongoing bombardments and the strain of heavy use. Radio communications were frequently disrupted by atmospheric conditions and enemy jamming, impairing coordination between units and command echelons. These difficulties impeded the ability of Soviet commanders to exploit breakthroughs or reinforce stalled attacks effectively. Morale among Soviet troops fluctuated during this period. On the one hand, political commissars and propaganda efforts sought to inspire soldiers with messages of sacrifice and eventual victory. The high stakes of the operation and the proximity to Moscow reinforced a sense of urgency and duty. On the other hand, the relentless nature of the fighting, heavy casualties, freezing conditions, and limited successes weighed heavily on soldiers' spirits. Many units suffered exhaustion, and instances of disorganization and breakdowns in discipline were reported, though overall cohesion was maintained. For the German defenders, the situation was also dire but different. Despite their successes in repelling Soviet offensives, they faced attrition in manpower and materiel, fatigue, and the constant threat of encirclement. Morale was bolstered by the tactical victories and the leadership of commanders like Model, who were respected for their ability to hold difficult positions under pressure. Nevertheless, the prolonged nature of the fighting and the harsh winter imposed severe strain. Civilian populations in and around the Rzhev salient endured catastrophic hardship during the peak of the campaign. Prolonged artillery bombardments and aerial raids devastated towns and villages, destroying homes, infrastructure, and agricultural resources. Many civilians were displaced, forced to flee into the harsh winter wilderness with minimal shelter and scarce food supplies. Exposure, starvation, and disease were common, compounded by the disruption of local governance and medical services. Humanitarian conditions deteriorated steadily as the combat persisted. Refugee flows overwhelmed remaining safe areas, and relief efforts struggled against logistical obstacles and ongoing hostilities. Both Soviet and German military authorities often prioritized military objectives over civilian welfare, further exacerbating suffering. Partisan activity in rear areas occasionally offered limited protection and assistance to some civilians, but also provoked harsh reprisals. Despite some localized Soviet successes in gaining ground or breaching certain German positions, the overall strategic situation remained essentially unchanged. The German Ninth Army maintained control over the salient, and Soviet forces failed to achieve the decisive encirclement that was the operation's ultimate goal. The front lines stabilized into a deadly stalemate, with gains measured in meters rather than kilometers. The peak of Operation Mars thus exemplified the brutal attritional warfare characteristic of much of the Eastern Front. Enormous losses of personnel and equipment were exchanged for marginal territorial changes. The operation tested the limits of both Soviet offensive capacity and German defensive endurance under extreme conditions. The high command on both sides faced the sobering reality that victory would not come swiftly or easily in this sector. In retrospect, this phase revealed critical limitations in Soviet operational planning and execution. Underestimation of German defensive depth, logistical overextension, and difficulties in command coordination hampered the offensive. German tactical proficiency and flexible defense proved highly effective in blunting one of the Red Army's largest winter offensives. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of soldiers from both armies perished or were wounded, and countless civilians suffered destruction, displacement, and death. The battle zone became a frozen graveyard marked by destroyed villages, shattered forests, and scarred landscapes. Ultimately, the peak fighting of Operation Mars ended without the Soviet success that was so urgently sought. The campaign's failure to break the German salient would delay Soviet advances in the region and require the re-evaluation of strategy and tactics in subsequent operations. It stood as a stark testament to the challenges of large-scale winter warfare on the Eastern Front and the staggering price paid by combatants and civilians alike. As Operation Mars dragged into the early months of 1943, the Soviet forces, faced with mounting casualties and limited gains, began to reassess and adapt their strategies in the face of fierce German resistance. The brutal winter conditions and rugged terrain, combined with the German army's effective defensive tactics, forced a shift away from costly frontal assaults towards more flexible and pragmatic approaches. Soviet commanders increasingly emphasized consolidating their positions, improving defensive arrangements, and launching localized counterattacks to disrupt German operations and seize tactical advantages. One key aspect of this adaptation was the increased reliance on partisan warfare behind German lines. Soviet partisan groups intensified sabotage efforts targeting German supply routes, communication networks, and rear area installations. These irregular forces sought to undermine the Wehrmacht's logistical capabilities, creating additional challenges for German commanders already stretched thin by the relentless frontline pressure. Although partisan activities did not directly alter frontline battle outcomes significantly, they contributed to an overall environment of attrition and insecurity for German forces. Soviet command also prioritized better resource management to sustain the offensive effort amid deteriorating conditions. Supplies of ammunition, winter clothing, fuel, and food were carefully rationed and directed towards critical sectors. Efforts were made to repair and maintain transportation networks despite the harsh weather and destruction wrought by months of combat. Technological and tactical innovations, including improved coordination between artillery, infantry, and armor, were pursued to enhance combat effectiveness. However, such efforts were often hampered by the complexities of the terrain, communication disruptions, and the ongoing strain on personnel and equipment. Morale among Soviet troops fluctuated widely during this protracted phase. Political officers and commissars maintained rigorous ideological indoctrination and propaganda campaigns to sustain fighting spirit, emphasizing the patriotic duty of resisting the fascist invader and the promise of eventual victory. Yet, the psychological toll of constant fighting, heavy losses, and extreme weather weighed heavily on many soldiers. Fatigue, fear, and frustration became common, and instances of decreased combat effectiveness were reported, though the Red Army's overall cohesion and discipline remained largely intact. The German defenders, despite being under continuous pressure, demonstrated remarkable resilience. Their defensive operations combined static fortifications with mobile reserves that allowed them to respond swiftly to Soviet probes and counterattacks. Maintaining the salient required sustained effort and sacrifices, but German commanders effectively balanced resource allocation, troop rotations, and local counteroffensives to hold key positions. Morale among German troops was bolstered by tactical successes and the leadership of experienced commanders who fostered unit cohesion amid adversity. Psychologically, the battle exerted a profound impact on combatants on both sides. The harsh conditions, combined with the unrelenting intensity of fighting, tested human endurance. Soldiers endured not only enemy fire, but also frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion. The prolonged stalemate bred a sense of futility for many, yet ideological commitment, discipline, and camaraderie sustained their resolve. The ebb and flow of localized victories and defeats created an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. Throughout this period, the war of attrition waged relentlessly. The Soviet leadership's decision to adapt tactics and improve resource utilization reflected a pragmatic acknowledgement of the operation's challenges. Yet the fundamental difficulties of breaking through entrenched defenses in inhospitable conditions remained. Operation Mars exemplified the brutal calculus of the Eastern Front, where human lives and materiel were expended at staggering rates in pursuit of often marginal territorial gains. The sustained resistance and adaptation phase underscored the complexity of offensive operations against a determined and experienced opponent. It revealed both the strengths and limitations of Soviet military doctrine at the time, and highlighted the vital role of logistical support, morale, and tactical flexibility in such campaigns. For civilians trapped in the war zone, the continuation of combat meant ongoing hardship, displacement, and suffering, further deepening the human cost of the battle. In summary, the period of resistance and adaptation during Operation Mars was marked by a transition from ambitious offensives toward more measured and defensive tactics. Partisan warfare increased pressure on German rear areas. Innovations in coordination sought to improve combat outcomes, and resource management became critical amid deteriorating conditions. The psychological toll was immense, yet both Soviet and German forces demonstrated resilience in the face of adversity. This phase set the stage for the eventual stalemate and failure of the operation to achieve its strategic goals, illustrating the grim realities of large-scale warfare on the Eastern Front during one of its coldest and bloodiest winters. As Operation Mars dragged through the harsh winter months of late 1942 and early 1943, it became increasingly clear that the campaign would not yield the decisive Soviet victory that had been envisioned. Unlike the simultaneous and strategically monumental Soviet success at Stalingrad, which dramatically shifted the balance on the Eastern Front, the fighting around the Rzhev salient devolved into a costly stalemate, signaling a crucial turning point not in favor of the Red Army. The German Ninth Army, under the experienced leadership of General Walter Model, successfully maintained its defensive integrity despite relentless Soviet pressure. The Wehrmacht's fortified positions, combined with flexible defensive tactics and rapid reinforcement capabilities, prevented Soviet forces from achieving the hoped-for encirclement and destruction of the salient. The failure to breach these defenses marked a significant operational setback for the Soviets and exposed key limitations in their planning, intelligence assessments, and logistical capabilities. For the Soviet High Command, the inability to deliver a decisive blow against the Rzhev salient forced a sobering reassessment of their offensive strategies. The Red Army had underestimated the depth, resilience, and tactical skill of the German defenders, as well as the formidable challenges posed by terrain and weather. Coordination difficulties among multiple Soviet fronts, supply shortages, and the attritional toll on infantry and armored units further compounded the challenges. This realization prompted strategic recalibrations in future operations, emphasizing better intelligence gathering, improved logistics, and more flexible tactics. The consequences of this turning point were severe for both military forces and the civilian population. Soviet troops suffered heavy casualties without achieving corresponding territorial gains, weakening their offensive potential in the region. German forces, while victorious in defense, were similarly strained and depleted, forced to commit reserves and endure prolonged hardship amid the unforgiving winter. The stalemate prolonged the conflict in the Rzhev area, resulting in continued destruction, displacement, and suffering for civilians caught in the combat zone. Humanitarian conditions deteriorated as prolonged fighting devastated infrastructure and agricultural resources. Civilians faced exposure to freezing temperatures, food shortages, and medical neglect. Refugees fled destroyed villages and towns, often seeking shelter in overcrowded and inadequately supplied areas. Both occupying German forces and Soviet partisans inflicted reprisals, further exacerbating civilian suffering. The turning point in the operation thus underscored the human cost of attritional warfare on the Eastern Front. Internationally, Operation Mars received little attention compared to the high-profile Soviet victory at Stalingrad, which had captured the world's focus. The lack of recognition contributed to Operation Mars's relative obscurity in the broader narrative of the Second World War, even though the battle exemplified the brutal challenges faced by the Red Army during this period. Strategically, the failure to eliminate the Rzhev salient prolonged German presence threatening Moscow and delayed Soviet advances in the region. It compelled Soviet commanders to rethink operational approaches, leading to changes in command assignments and adjustments in future offensives such as Operation Bagration in 1944, which ultimately succeeded in driving German forces from Soviet territory. The turning point in Operation Mars thus represents a critical moment of strategic frustration for the Soviets, highlighting the complexities of offensive operations against well-entrenched, experienced defenders under harsh winter conditions. It exposed vulnerabilities in Soviet military planning while demonstrating the resilience and tactical proficiency of the German Wehrmacht. The stalemate and resulting heavy losses on both sides left a lasting imprint on the course of the Eastern Front, serving as a sobering reminder of the high human and material costs inherent in the war's vast and brutal theater. By early 1943, the prolonged and costly combat operations around the Rzhev salient began to wind down as both Soviet and German forces faced exhaustion and depleted resources. The Soviet offensive, unable to achieve its strategic encirclement goals, was effectively halted, and frontline positions largely stabilized. Soviet troops withdrew from some contested forward areas, consolidating into more defensible lines while maintaining pressure where possible. German forces retained control of the salient, continuing to occupy the strategically important bulge west of Moscow until later in 1943, when shifting front lines and broader Soviet offensives forced their eventual withdrawal. The aftermath of Operation Mars revealed the extensive physical devastation inflicted upon the contested region. Months of relentless artillery barrages, aerial bombardments, and ground fighting reduced towns and villages to rubble. Infrastructure, including roads, railways, bridges, and communication networks, lay in ruins, severely hampering movement and supply efforts for both armies. The destruction compounded logistical difficulties during and after the fighting, delaying recovery and complicating subsequent military operations. Civilian populations bore the brunt of the devastation and disruption. Many were displaced, forced to flee from their homes amid the ongoing conflict and harsh winter conditions. Starvation, exposure, disease, and injury became widespread as medical care and food supplies dwindled. Refugees sought shelter wherever possible, often in overcrowded and inadequate facilities. Both Soviet and German military authorities prioritized military objectives over civilian welfare, limiting humanitarian assistance and sometimes conducting punitive reprisals against suspected collaborators or partisan sympathizers, exacerbating civilian suffering. The operation's end also exposed the human cost of the stalemate. Soviet forces endured heavy casualties with limited territorial gains, weakening offensive capabilities in the sector. German troops, though victorious in defense, were similarly depleted and had to expend significant effort maintaining their positions. The attritional nature of the battle reflected the broader character of Eastern Front warfare. where strategic progress was often measured in meters at immense cost. The withdrawal phase of Operation Mars marked a grim chapter in the war's Eastern Front. It underscored the brutal reality of protracted attritional warfare, where gains were hard-fought and often temporary, and the suffering of combatants and civilians alike was profound. The lessons learned in logistics, command coordination, and operational planning during this period informed future Soviet offensives, contributing to the eventual breakthroughs that would help turn the tide of the war. Humanitarian crises persisted beyond the cessation of hostilities. Reconstruction efforts were slow amid ongoing military pressures and resource scarcity. The devastated landscapes of the Rojhev region remained scarred for years, a stark testament to the destructive capacity of modern industrial warfare. The aftermath of Operation Mars thus embodied not only a military failure, but a tragic episode of human loss and endurance amid one of history's most brutal conflicts. Operation Mars occupies a complex and often overlooked place in the history of the Second World War's Eastern Front. Unlike the celebrated and decisive victories such as Stalingrad or Kursk, Mars was a costly and ultimately unsuccessful Soviet offensive that failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Its relative obscurity in popular narratives stems largely from the concurrent global focus on Stalingrad, which overshadowed other simultaneous operations and became the defining Soviet triumph of 1942-43. In the long term, Operation Mars illuminated critical shortcomings and hard lessons for the Soviet military. The failure underscored limitations in Soviet intelligence, which underestimated German defensive preparations and resilience. It revealed challenges in command and control coordination across multiple fronts under difficult terrain and harsh winter conditions. Logistical difficulties highlighted the immense complexity of sustaining large-scale offensives in adverse environments. These experiences influenced Soviet doctrinal developments, leading to improvements in combined arms tactics, operational planning, and logistical support that contributed to the successes of later campaigns. Politically, the Soviet leadership chose to downplay Operation Mars publicly, suppressing detailed information to maintain morale and the image of inexorable Soviet progress. Soviet propaganda emphasized victories elsewhere, particularly at Stalingrad, while the costly stalemate at Rojhev was kept from wide public view. As a result, the operation's memory remained limited within Soviet society and largely absent from Western historical accounts for many years. Culturally and historically, Operation Mars is primarily studied within Russian and Eastern European military scholarship, where it is recognized as a sobering example of the brutal realities of Eastern Front warfare. Memorialization of the battle is modest, with few monuments or commemorations dedicated specifically to it. The human cost, tens of thousands of casualties on both sides, and widespread civilian suffering, is acknowledged but often overshadowed by larger, more decisive engagements. Nonetheless, Operation Mars stands as a testament to the immense sacrifices and complexities faced by the Red Army and the German Wehrmacht during one of history's deadliest and most challenging theaters of war. It exemplifies the harsh attritional warfare that characterized much of the Eastern Front, where victory was not always swift or complete, and the line between success and failure was often measured in costly inches. The operation remains a reminder of the strategic difficulties, human endurance, and tragic losses that defined the conflict between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.